November 28, 2016, began like hundreds of other charter flights in South America. On paper, LaMia Flight 2933 was just a direct route from Santa Cruz de la Sierra, Bolivia to Rio Negro, Colombia. A charter flight with no general ticket sales, no fixed schedule. The type of flight the aviation industry handles every day, provided everything is calculated correctly. But it is precisely in these off-schedule flights that the line between normalcy and disaster is often thinnest. LaMia was not a major airline. It was a small company specializing in charters, mainly serving sports teams, event organizers, and groups needing fast, streamlined travel on their own schedules. This model exists worldwide, and in itself, it is not wrong. Charters save time, avoid layovers, and take a whole group straight from point A to point B. But in exchange, every technical and operational decision is concentrated in a very small group: the flight planner, the approver, and the flight crew. On Flight 2933 that day was almost the entire Brazilian football team Chapecoense, the coaching staff, several sports journalists, and the crew. They were on their way to Colombia to prepare for a historic match for the club. For them, this was a business trip. For the airline, this was a package deal, direct flight, non-stop. The aircraft used was an Avro RJ-85, a four-engine jet with moderate range, typically used for regional routes. It was not a new aircraft, nor was it a rare type. For many years, the RJ-85 had proven that if operated correctly, it does its job well. The problem did not lie with the aircraft itself, but in how this flight was planned. The distance from Santa Cruz to Medellin is not short. This was not a one-hour domestic hop. It demanded precise fuel calculations, considering altitude, weather, flight path, and the possibility of holding in the air upon approaching the destination airport. In the industry, these are fundamental factors, almost professional reflexes. There is no room for guesswork or hoping everything will be fine. However, Flight 2933 was planned as a minimalist journey. Direct flight, no intermediate stops, no realistic backup plan. On paper, it was just enough to get there. In aviation reality, just enough is a very dangerous phrase, because the sky rarely operates exactly as it does on the plan. Medellin is not an easily accessible airport, surrounded by mountainous terrain, rapidly changing weather, and air traffic that can cause aircraft to wait. Those factors are no surprise to anyone who has flown into this region. They have been documented, warned about, and repeated in many operational manuals. But the flight was still approved. From the perspective of someone who has followed this industry for over 3 decades, this is the key point of the story. Not when the plane was in the air, not the final moment. Everything was decided on the ground, in the planning room, when they chose an option that was low risk in terms of cost and time, but high in consequences if anything went wrong. The flight took off from Santa Cruz under normal conditions. No obvious signs of instability, but the closer it got to Colombia, the more the safety margin eroded. As the aircraft approached the Medellin area, air traffic increased. Holding in the air is not unusual, but it consumes the one thing this flight did not have to spare: fuel. From the outside, everything still looked like a flight performing landing procedures like any other. But inside the system, the clock was counting down. No room left for error. No easy option left to divert. A charter flight, flying direct, was now locked by its own initial plan. What makes this incident mentioned years later is not just the numbers or the passenger list. It is because it exposed a familiar but often overlooked reality. Aviation accidents rarely begin in the sky. They begin with quiet decisions, legal on paper, but fragile in reality. LaMia Flight 2933 is not a story about a bad luck plane. It is a story about how a charter flight, seemingly simple, can become a journey with no exit when every layer of safety is cut to the absolute minimum. And that is why, in aviation, the flights that seem the most normal sometimes carry the greatest risks. When the sky closed, the moment Flight 2933 had no way back. As Flight 2933 entered Medellin airspace, the story moved to a different chapter. It was no longer a matter of plans on paper, nor assumptions on the ground. At this point, every small accumulated error began to reveal itself, bit by bit, like numbers appearing on the instrument panel without the need for long explanations. Jose Maria Cordova Airport sits amidst high mountainous terrain. This is a place where planes do not gently glide in for a landing. Every approach requires time, space, and precise coordination with air traffic control. For flights with surplus fuel, this is just a routine part of the job. For Flight 2933, it was the final challenge. When the aircraft was asked to hold in the air, everything began to compress. In aviation, waiting means depletion. There are no miracles here. The engines keep running, time keeps passing, and the remaining fuel drops by the minute. There is no shortcut to make up for what was calculated too tightly from the start. Then came the time when the system began to speak its truth. First were the warnings familiar to any pilot who has flown jets. Nothing dramatic, just clear signals that the safety margin was exhausted. When there is not enough fuel to feed the engines, the aircraft is no longer an active vehicle. It becomes a heavy block of metal, dependent entirely on remaining altitude and the terrain below. One by one, the engines fell into silence. Not a sudden malfunction, but the inevitable result of having nothing left to sustain the system's life. In that moment, Flight 2933 was no longer flying in the conventional sense. It was just gliding through space like an object gradually losing kinetic energy. At this stage, nearly all options had closed. The airport was right ahead, but not close enough. The surrounding terrain allowed for no deviation. This is when decisions from hours ago returned, unforgiving, non-negotiable. The Avro RJ-85 lost altitude in silence. There was no mid-air explosion, no familiar imagery that movies often construct. Just a journey ending when the aircraft impacted the mountainside in the Cerro Gordo area, near La Union, Antioquia. This location was not on any tourist map, but from that night on, it became a name mentioned around the world. The consequences were irreversible. Of the roughly 77 people on board, only 6 survived. The remaining number is proof that when aviation loses its final layer of protection, fuel, there is nothing left to correct the mistake. This was not an accident due to abnormal weather, not due to structural failure, nor a rare technical glitch. It was the direct result of the exhaustion of the most basic resource to keep a plane in the air. From a professional perspective, the most notable thing is not the moment of impact, but the chain of events leading up to it. When the plane lost all engines due to fuel starvation, everything had already been determined beforehand. At that point, it was no longer a matter of skill or reflexes. The system could not give more than what it was given from the start. Those working in the industry understand an unspoken rule. Aviation accidents are rarely one big mistake. It is usually the sum of many small choices, each appearing reasonable in isolation. Flying direct to save time, not stopping to keep the schedule, believing weather and traffic would be favorable, believing it should be enough. But when those assumptions stack up, there is no room left for reality. After the incident, the numbers were released cold and clear. 71 people did not return, 6 survived. These numbers do not need emotional commentary to be heavy. They speak for themselves about what the aviation industry has long known but sometimes forgets. No flight is allowed to rely on luck. Flight 2933 ended in the darkness of the Colombian mountains, but its story did not stop there. It became a prime example of a type of accident that experts call avoidable. Not because it was easy, but because every link in this chain was within human control. And precisely because of that, the consequences of this accident reached far beyond the crash site. It forced the aviation industry to look back at how charter flights are planned, monitored, and approved. It reminds us that the sky does not forgive calculations made on the edge. When the fuel runs out, the sky closes. And at that moment, all explanations arrive too late. When just enough became not enough. The deadly mistake in fuel calculation. After Flight 2933 ended in the mountains near Medellin, many outsiders asked the same question. How could a commercial jet run completely dry of fuel mid-flight? For those who have been in aviation long enough, that question sounds more familiar than one might think. Not because it happens often, but because whenever it happens, the cause is almost always the same. A plan calculated so tightly that there is no room for reality to intervene. In aviation, fuel is not just something to get the plane from point A to point B. It is a safety buffer. It is time bought during bad weather. It is space to maneuver when the airport is crowded, when circling is needed, when immediate landing is impossible. International regulations do not set reserve fuel requirements because they are superfluous. They are written in the sweat and mistakes of decades past. With Flight 2933, the calculation was performed in the most minimalist way possible. The aircraft took off with enough fuel to fly straight to Medellin, plus very little, too little, compared to what regulations require for an alternate airport. On paper, this route was enough. But paper doesn't have weather. Paper doesn't have air traffic. And paper cannot reflect the complexity of approaching an airport nestled in the mountains. Throughout my career, I have seen many flight plans like this. They often appear on charter flights where pressure regarding cost, schedule, and convenience is placed on par with, or even higher than, the safety margin. Flying direct to save time, not stopping to keep the contract tidy. Each individual decision can be explained, but when combined, they create a flight with no exit. It is important to understand, there were no unexpected requirements for Flight 2933. Medellin did not suddenly become crowded. The terrain did not suddenly appear. Those factors were always there, clearly stated in aviation documents. But this flight's fuel plan was not built to cope with them. It was built on the assumption that everything would go according to an ideal scenario. And aviation rarely operates according to an ideal scenario. When the aircraft had to hold in the air, the already thin fuel reserve began to drain rapidly. There was no truly viable alternate airport within reach. There was no proper Plan B. What should have been a backup option was eliminated from the moment the plane was still on the ground. This is the point many outsiders find hard to accept. This accident did not start when the engines shut down. It started when fuel was pumped into the aircraft, when it was decided that just this much is enough. In aviation, enough is never the safety standard. The standard is surplus. Regulations require aircraft to carry fuel to fly to the destination, then fly on to an alternate airport and still have a final reserve. That is not a formality. That is the last fence between a difficult flight and an irreparable outcome. Flight 2933 stepped over that fence with nothing to stop it. When fuel ran out, the system had no choice. The engines didn't fail in a technical sense. They simply had nothing left to run on. This is the coldest fact in aviation. Machines do not care about intentions or circumstances. They only react to physical conditions. Looking back, there was no single moment to blame. No crazy decision, no incomprehensible maneuver. Only a chain of familiar choices, made in a familiar environment, by people who believed they could walk close to the edge one more time. That is why incidents like Flight 2933 still happen, even in the age of radar, satellites, and dense procedures. Technology can assist, but it cannot replace operational discipline. When that discipline is eroded by habit and commercial pressure, risks accumulate silently. Running out of fuel is not a freak accident. It is the predictable result of a miscalculation. And in aviation, such miscalculations do not give second chances. Flight 2933 became a clear reminder that the sky does not reward recklessness, and that safety margins exist to be used, not to be cut. Decisions of no return. When humans ignored the last exit, after the fuel had been calculated tightly and the safety margin thinned, the story of Flight 2933 enters its most difficult part, the human decisions throughout the journey. This was no longer purely a technical issue, but how the flight crew and operations department reacted, or failed to react, to increasingly clear signals that the flight was entering a zone of no return. According to investigation conclusions, the low fuel level was not a surprise to the flight crew. It was right there on the instrument panel, displayed continuously, requiring no interpretation. In this industry, no one accidentally doesn't know how much fuel they have left. The problem was not a lack of information, but how that information was processed. And in this case, it was pushed aside for too long. When flying charters, pressure does not come from a single factor. It is a combination of schedule, cost, and the mentality of seeing it through. Once airborne with a direct flight plan, changing minds midway always feels like admitting the initial plan was flawed. In a weak operational environment, that feeling easily turns into prolonged silence, where people keep going just because they are halfway there. The option to land en route to refuel always existed theoretically, but to execute it required a decisive decision made early, which could disrupt the entire schedule. With Flight 2933, that decision was not made. Instead, the crew continued to fly straight, relying on the assumption that they could manage a little longer, a few more minutes, one more holding pattern. In aviation, this is a familiar trap. People call it by many names, but the essence is the same. Delaying action in the hope that the situation will improve itself. Sometimes it's right, but when it's wrong, the price to pay is always enormous. Alongside the flight crew, LaMia's operations department played an equally important role. The flight plan was approved from the start with minimum fuel. There was no timely intervention from the ground to demand a change in plan. In a healthy safety system, ground and cockpit must be two independent layers of control, ready to block a dangerous decision. Here, both those layers failed to function. One of the key points was the failure to notify air traffic control of the critical situation early. In the industry, language is not just words, but a life-saving tool. When an aircraft declares an emergency, the entire surrounding system shifts priorities immediately. The flight path is cleared, other aircraft are ordered to move, and all resources focus on getting that plane to the ground as fast as possible. But Flight 2933 did not do that until it was too late. Instead of activating the system's red light, they kept communication at a normal level, as if the situation was still under control. This is not rare. Many crews hesitate to declare an emergency for fear of judgment, post-flight scrutiny, or simply because they believe they still have the ability to handle it. In 30 years of tracking similar incidents, I see this as a weakness of human nature rather than professional skill. People do not want to admit that things have gone off plan. And in aviation, a few minutes of hesitation can slam the final door shut. When the situation finally became impossible to hide, the system no longer had enough time to react. Not because air traffic control was slow, but because the call for help came too late. What could have been an urgent priority was now just belated information. Notably, there is no evidence that the crew lacked flying skills. This is not a story about people who didn't know what they were doing. On the contrary, it is a story about people too accustomed to pushing the limits without consequences, until that limit disappeared. This chain of wrong decisions did not happen in a single moment. It formed gradually through each small choice. Not stopping to refuel, not adjusting the plan, not declaring an emergency early. Each choice seemed reasonable when viewed in isolation. But when combined, they created a situation with no escape. That is why subsequent investigations focused not only on the cockpit but looked deep into the operational culture of the airline. When a system allows multiple risky decisions to follow one another without being stopped, an accident is no longer a surprise. It is only a matter of time. Flight 2933 repeats an old aviation lesson. Engineering can keep a plane in the air, but human decisions determine whether it lands safely. And when humans ignore early exits, the sky will not open new doors to wait. When a football team vanished mid-journey, the collision between aviation and sports, as news of Flight 2933 spread, its impact did not stop within the aviation industry. This time, the consequences spilled directly into another world, football. Not in the loud manner of goals or titles, but in a silent, empty way, forcing an entire tournament to stop and look down. Chapecoense was not a big name in Brazilian football. It was a small club of humble origins, grown through discipline, cohesion, and seasons exceeding expectations. Their presence in the Copa Sudamericana 2016 final was not a given. It was the result of years of slow ascent, steady steps, much like a small airline trying to survive among industry giants. Because of that, the trip to Colombia held special meaning. Not a routine tour, but a historic milestone for the entire club. On the plane that day was almost the entire operational framework of Chapecoense. Players, coaching staff, logistics team, and media. A team literally placed entirely on the same journey. When the flight ended in the mountains near Medellin, Brazilian football lost not just people, but an entire structure. There is no reserve squad for losses of this kind. There is no quick fix. A club exists thanks to continuity, from the training ground to the locker room, and that continuity was completely severed. The reaction of the football world came very fast, but was not ostentatious. Leagues paused. Stadiums turned off lights. No need for many explanations. Everyone understood that this was not the time to talk about results or titles. Copa Sudamericana, a tournament organized to honor regional competitive spirit, suddenly became a symbol of fragility. From the perspective of a longtime aviation professional, what struck me was not just the mourning, but how sports reflected the nature of this accident. Chapecoense was a collective built on mutual trust, and Flight 2933 was the same. Everyone placed their trust in a plan, a schedule, a promise that everything had been calculated. When that trust collapsed, the consequences spread wider than any technical report could describe. In Brazil, football is not just a sport. It is a part of social life. For a club to nearly vanish overnight forced many to re-ask questions about things seemingly unrelated. How sports teams travel, how charter flights are selected, and who bears the final responsibility for those decisions. The shock came not from the element of surprise, but from the scale of the loss. An aviation accident is often viewed through the lens of numbers. But here, each number represented a position on the field, a role in the team, a part of a functioning system. When that entire system is taken away at once, there is no way to call it local damage. Remarkably, Chapecoense did not disappear from the football map after the accident. The club was rebuilt with support from other teams and the federation. But that reconstruction does not change the essence of the lesson. No sporting achievement is large enough to justify trading safety in travel. From the aviation industry side, this incident created rare pressure. When passengers are not a scattered group, but an entire team being closely watched by the public, every operational error is immediately exposed under the media spotlight. What was previously only discussed in technical meeting rooms now became a public question. Why was such a flight allowed to take off? The answer does not lie in football, but football made that question impossible to ignore. The loss of Chapecoense forced both industries, sports and aviation, to look back at how they intersect. When a football team boards a plane, they bring not just dreams of competition. They place the lives of the entire collective into a chain of decisions they do not directly control. And that is the cold connection between this story and what happened before. From the fuel plan to the decision not to stop to not reporting danger in time, all were silent choices. But their consequences were not silent at all. Flight 2933 closed Chapecoense's journey in a way no one wanted. But its legacy persists as a clear reminder that in any field, from aviation to sports, success should never be built on an unsafe foundation. When an operational system ignores that principle, the price paid often does not belong to an individual, but to an entire collective. When the file was opened, the accident was not a mystery, but a consequence of a broken system. After the wreckage was located and the scene secured, the story of Flight 2933 entered the phase the aviation industry knows best: investigation. In this phase, there is no room for speculation or sentiment. Everything is put on the dissection table: paperwork, procedures, approval chains, to answer a cold but necessary question. Why was such a flight allowed to exist in the first place? The Colombian Aviation Authority did not look for a single error. In cases like this, if someone asks who is responsible, the answer is often uncomfortable. Very many people at very many different points. And Flight 2933 is a prime example of a system where safety layers failed simultaneously. The investigation quickly pointed out that the error did not start in the air. It started at the planning table. LaMia's flight plan was approved despite not meeting full international fuel standards. This was not a matter of vague interpretation. The regulations existed clearly. There must be reserve fuel, there must be a viable alternate airport, there must be a margin to handle unforeseen situations. This plan lacked all of those, yet was still passed. In a healthy operating airline, such a plan would be blocked from the start. No debate, no negotiation. But at LaMia, those fences were thinned to the point of being nearly ineffective. The planner accepted the risk. The approver did not ask questions. And the system allowed the flight to take one more step toward the edge of the cliff. The investigation also showed that LaMia did not just make a mistake on a single flight. The approach of flying on the edge had become an operational habit. When a small airline continuously executes long-haul charter flights with minimal safety margins without incident, a false sense of safety forms. Each successful flight becomes proof to justify the next one. This is a dangerous rule in aviation. Repeated success does not equal safety, but is very easily misunderstood as such. The flight crew's responsibility was also dissected thoroughly. No one denies that pilots are the last line of defense. But the investigation showed they were placed in a situation where safe options had been eliminated beforehand. When the flight plan has no realistic alternate airport, when fuel is calculated tightly, the cockpit has little room left to correct mistakes. However, continuing to fly straight and not declaring danger early were still active decisions, and thus cannot be overlooked in the conclusion. Here, the investigation did not seek to make the pilots scapegoats. Instead, it placed them in their correct position in the chain of errors. An important link, but not the only one. The larger mistake lay in the system allowing such decisions to be viewed as acceptable. Another notable point was the lack of oversight from the regulatory body in the airline's home country. International charter flights demand a higher level of scrutiny, not lower. But in this case, supervision processes did not keep up with LaMia's operational reality. When a small airline operates across borders with high frequency, every loophole in management is quickly magnified. From the perspective of someone who has followed hundreds of investigation reports, I see this pattern repeating sadly. Accidents happen not because of a lack of laws, but because laws are not enforced thoroughly. International fuel standards are not soft recommendations. They are red lines. When that line is treated as flexible, an accident is only a matter of time. Colombia's final investigation report did not use dramatic language. It didn't need to. The conclusions were clear enough for anyone in the industry to understand what went wrong. Unsafe flight planning, uncontrolled approval, weak internal procedures, an operational culture accepting high risk, all added up to create a flight that should not have existed in the first place. After the report, LaMia ceased operations. But closing an airline does not mean the problem is solved. The investigation aimed at a larger goal, forcing the aviation industry to re-examine charter flights, where risk is often hidden under the guise of flexibility and convenience. Flight 2933 became a classic case study in safety training courses, not because it was technically complex, but because it was terrifyingly simple. No design flaw, no extreme weather, only a chain of wrong decisions allowed by the system to pass without being stopped. And that is the core lesson from this investigation. When responsibility is dispersed to the point where no one feels they are the final person who must say stop, then an accident is no longer a surprise. It is just the delayed result of a system that has been broken for a long time, but continued to operate until there was nothing left to hide. The legacy of a flight that should not have existed. When the investigation file closed, the aviation industry did not see it as the end. For those who have worked in the trade long enough, the post-accident phase is the most important part. That is when the question, what happened, is replaced by what have we learned, and do we have the courage to change? Flight 2933 left a heavy legacy, not because of what happened in the sky, but because of what it exposed on the ground. The biggest lesson, and also the simplest, lies in fuel. In aviation, fuel is not just a number in a spreadsheet. It is time, it is choice, it is space to correct mistakes. When that space is erased, every situation becomes a one-way situation. This accident forced the entire industry to look straight at reality. Fuel management is not a dry technical issue, but the foundation of flight safety. After the incident, many aviation authorities began reviewing how they examine charter flight plans. Previously, charter flights were often viewed with an eye for flexibility, sometimes as controlled exceptions. But Flight 2933 showed that the line between flexible and reckless is thinner than many think. When a special flight is treated as normal while carrying higher risks, the system has put itself in a weak position. Another important change relates to how emergency situations are reported. For years, the aviation industry has talked a lot about early reporting culture. But saying is easy, doing is hard. This accident is a cold reminder that delay in communication is no small matter. When information is withheld too long, external support systems have no chance to intervene. And when the chance passes, consequences are irreversible. It is worth noting that these lessons are not new. They have appeared in previous reports from many different places around the world. But like a warning sign placed at a dangerous curve, if the driver is used to speeding without ever getting into trouble, the sign gradually becomes invisible. Flight 2933 forced the aviation industry to stop, step out of the car, and read that sign again slowly and seriously. At the international level, oversight organizations began paying more attention to small airlines operating across borders. Not because being small is bad, but because when resources are limited, economic pressure easily pushes operational decisions beyond the level of safety. This accident clarified a reality. Safety standards cannot be elastic based on scale or circumstance. Either they exist or they don't. For flights carrying sports teams and special groups, the lesson is even clearer. These are flights driven by timing, subject to schedule pressure, media, and expectations. Precisely those factors push the risk higher than normal. After the incident, many authorities required stricter checks on fuel factors, backup airports, and alternative options for this type of flight. Not to make things difficult, but to remind that the schedule is never more important than the safety margin. From the perspective of someone who has followed this industry for over 3 decades, I see the greatest legacy of Flight 2933 lies not in new regulations written down, but in how thinking was forced to change. This accident exposed a dangerous habit, treating "it hasn't happened yet" as proof that it won't happen. In aviation, that is the way of thinking that leads to mistakes fastest. The legacy also lies in emphasizing collective responsibility. There is no longer room for the mindset of "someone else will check." When each link waits for the next link, the safety chain becomes fragile. This flight showed that safety is not created at a single point, but is maintained continuously from the desk to the cockpit, from the meeting room to the control tower. Many years later, when the incident no longer appears on the front page, it is still mentioned in training classes and internal reviews. Not to evoke tragedy, but to remind that aviation accidents are rarely the result of a single decision. It is the result of prolonged laxity, of exceptions repeated until they become norms. If I had to encapsulate the lesson of Flight 2933 in one sentence, I would say this: flight safety fails not because of a lack of knowledge, but because knowledge is ignored. When fuel is calculated tightly, when warnings are delayed, when regulations are viewed as suggestions, the flight has already begun to leave the safe zone long before leaving the runway. That is the true legacy of this flight. A quiet but heavy enough reminder that in aviation, the cost of going a little further is often much higher than stopping at the right time.